morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are listening from or even listening to the recording. My name is Greg Robertson, and welcome to tonight's EMEA vBrownbag. On tonight's EMEA vBrownbag is Sean Massey. Sean, I should have practiced your surname. I always do this to people. I don't practice their surnames before, so I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. And Sean's going to be covering an introduction to vCenter. So he's going to be doing an introduction, the installation configuration, SSO, SQL, and he's even daringly said he was going to do a demo. So I'm looking forward to it. Guys, normal stuff. If you have any questions, then you can write them in the question area. You can tweet them on Twitter with the hashtag vBrownbag, and either which way I'll try to get the questions asked. And I think that covers most stuff. I am recording this, so actually if you're watching the recording then you know that. Hopefully this is interesting to everybody. We've been doing a VCP series between the US and the EMEA vBrownbag, so we're kind of tag teaming it and going through it, hopefully helping people who are still early on in their virtualization path, or people who are just haven't done the VCP yet and they need to do it before vSphere Zooming 6 is the next one going to come out. VCP 6 then comes out, so awesome. I'll stop babbling and I will give Sean control, and then the hour is Sean's from there.
All right, thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. As Greg said, my name is Sean Massey. I am coming to you tonight from sunny old Wisconsin. Well, not too sunny right now. And let's start the presentation here. All right, can everybody see that fine? I know in the past with some vBrownbags, the WebEx thing on the side kind of gets in the way. So can everybody see it fine, or is there a big black shadow over the screen?
No, I can see it. Introduction to vCenter, and I can't see anything in the right-hand corner either.
In the right-hand corner. Okay, hold on one second. I have to.
I'm saying I can't see anything there.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay.
So as Greg mentioned, I'm going to be covering Introduction to vCenter. Now, this is one of the items on the VCP 5.5 exam blueprint. And so what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to, as he alluded to, some of the basics of vCenter, what the different components are, the differences, or the system requirements, database requirements, talk a little bit about single sign-on, and if time allows, we'll get to a couple of live demos. So, all right, let's see. Just a little bit about myself. I work for I work as a systems administrator for a mid-size electrical contractor in Wisconsin. The company I work for, we have offices in 5 states, and we're working jobs pretty much in all 50. I am a blogger. I blog at seanmassey.net. Usually I blog about VDI-related topics, especially with Horizon View. I just wrapped up a series on Horizon View 5.3. I'm also active on Twitter at Sean P. Massey, and I have a VCP. It's 5.1, and I have also passed the VCP-DCV. So a lot of the topics here today, I haven't taken the VCP 5.5 exam, but I am familiar with a lot of them because there's a lot of crossover between 5.1 and 5.5. So let's just dive right into this and answer the question, what is vCenter? When you build an environment with vSphere, you don't necessarily have to have vCenter, but there's a lot that it enables. If if you have multiple hosts, which almost everybody does, if you have servers in multiple sites, it will act as essentially your control plane for your virtual environment. Okay, it will handle all the background management tasks for you, and it will act as your single point of management. So instead of having to log into multiple hosts to do management, you can log into one. It enables you to treat your vCenter or your vSphere environment as one pool of resources as opposed to a bunch of individual hosts. Having vCenter also enables a number of advanced VMware features. If you have it, you have the option. You can enable DRS. You can enable things like auto deploy for stateless deployment of your host. It's not required to actually keep some of these features running, such as HA or virtual distributed switch, where once you get it configured, it runs without vCenter. But in those cases, you actually need to have vCenter in order to configure those options. And finally, it's a central integration point for a vSphere environment. A number of VMware products, such as Horizon View, vCloud Director, VCSA, they all tie into vCenter to be able to do some of the more advanced things that you'd want to do with your virtual environment, like building a private cloud. And then there's other third-party tools, like such as OpenStack, Veeam, where they'll tie into vCenter to be able to enable third-party functionality. So what are some of the core components of your vCenter environment? There's four main core components. There's the vCenter service itself, and this is what's been around for probably since vCenter 2.0 or vSphere. I don't remember what it was called back then. I think ESXi 2.5 or GSX 1.0. I mean, there's been something akin to vCenter that entire time. The vCenter service also includes Orchestrator and the profile-driven storage features. The next one is the web client. This is kind of a newer feature that VMware has been adding. They've been trying to push everybody to this web client, but it's basically a Flash-driven browser interface for managing your vCenter environment. Since version 5.1, VMware has only been enabling new features through the web client, and they've really done some major performance improvements with 5.5. There's also an inventory service, which enables an administrator to more easily search through the inventory of a vCenter environment and find things faster without necessarily having to go back and query the database. In the Mastering vSphere 5.5 book by Scott Lowe and crew, there's about 6 authors on that book, they mentioned that the inventory service also helps improve the performance of the web client. And then finally, the most controversial of the core components is the vCenter single sign-on. This is a newer component. It was introduced in vSphere 5.1. In vSphere 5.5, they've made some significant improvements to it that enable you to do multi-master replication across multiple sites. It enables you to, there's some stuff out there on how to do load balancing with it, but it's basically a custom LDAP database that ties in with vSphere, and if this component's not there in vSphere 5.5, you actually won't be able to log in either to the web client or to vCenter through the C# client. So it's a very important piece to keep running. So there are some other components to vCenter. I'll quickly mention some of them here. vCenter Update Manager, which will be going away as of the next version. According to VMware, they've already indicated VUM is essentially a dying product. vCenter Orchestrator, which is an automation engine for automating both your vSphere environment and through the plugin architecture that they have. Other systems. There's stuff out there on how to automate Horizon View, how to automate your Windows environment. You can do anything over SSH. So there's a lot of functionality in the Orchestrator product. Then there's the bottom four, which kind of all go together, auto-deploy, and a number of tools to help support an auto-deploy infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, auto-deploy it's a tool for doing stateless deployments of ESXi hosts. So if you have a very large data center and you want to be able to deploy ESXi without having to worry about disks or without having to worry about physically installing it on your host, say you're constantly churning through servers and you just need to keep everything deployed and ready to go, auto deploy is really the tool for you. It enables you to do network booting of ESXi hosts, and then these other three tools here help support that. Because these hosts are stateless and you're not actually installing it to a hard drive, there's really no place to collect things like your vSphere logs, or if you have a purple screen to do a memory dump, or to configure it for Active Directory authentication. So those bottom three tools enable you to collect that information from hosts deployed through auto-deploy and store it to somewhere on the network. So with vCenter, starting with version 5.0, there are two different types. There's the Windows application, which obviously runs on a Windows server, and then there's the vCenter virtual appliance. And you'll hear that referred to as VCSA or VCVA. The differences between the two, there are many, but they all support the four basic core features. The appliance comes with them configured pretty much right out of the box. The Windows server obviously we'll go through later, which requires installs. VMware has made a significant improvements to the vCenter virtual appliance with 5.5 to the point where the old appliance you can only run 5 hosts, 50 VMs. That's what kind of VMware's recommendation was. With 5.5, they've actually upped it to 100 hosts and 3,000 VMs with the embedded database. One of the drawbacks to that appliance, though, is that it has no support for SQL Server. Now, that is a Microsoft issue. Microsoft has SQL Server Odbc drivers for SUSE, but they're community technical preview. And so they have no official support. And the people I've talked to at VMware, and from what I've heard at VMworld, is that if Microsoft were to actually release those as a fully supported product, VMware would then be able to support SQL Server on the appliance. But until Microsoft actually gets around to doing that, VMware can't really release it as a supported option. The virtual appliance also comes with all the auto-deploy features installed and ready to run. So there's a couple boxes you can check in there to turn those on. Compared to the Windows application, it supports SQL Server and Oracle databases. You have a lot more options for configuring your Windows Server appliance. Because you're installing each of the 4 core components individually, you can actually split them up amongst multiple servers. And then you'll have the option to point to whichever one you need as you're doing your configuration. The server application also supports linked mode for being able to manage multiple vCenters from one interface, and vCenter Heartbeat for high availability. Now, one thing I'll note about Heartbeat is VMware just recently announced that is also going to hit end of life, or it has hit end of life, so that won't be around much longer either. And finally, the Windows can support up to 1,000 hosts and 10,000 VMs with any of the database options that are available. Which one should you use? Well, that really depends on which one's best going to fit your needs. You know, if you know Windows, you have a full Windows infrastructure, or if you need SQL Server, the Windows one's right for you. If you don't need it, or you just need to drop something in and get it up and running, the appliance may be the best fit. In all, it comes down to picking the best one that will fit your needs, or the needs of your customer, or the needs of your environment. So, and finally, vCenter comes in 3 editions. The one most people probably have is the standard edition. This has all the features. There's no artificial limits on hosts or VMs in the environment. And so it'll support linked mode. It supports up to 1,000 hosts. Then there's the foundation version. This is kind of a basic version of vCenter. It doesn't support linked mode, and there's a 3-host limit. So if you're working with a very small environment, but you have standard or enterprise plus licensing, this may be the option for you. And the final one is the Essentials version. It's essentially vSphere Foundation or vCenter Foundation, but it's included with the Essentials Edition kit. So if you're familiar with that bundle, it's 3 hosts. It's sold at a great price for small businesses, and this is the version of vCenter that comes with it. Okay. So, system requirements for vCenter. There's 2 ways you can kind of go with this here. If you're installing everything on individual hosts, the settings that I have here on the screen, 2 cores, 4 gig of memory, 4 gig of disk, that's kind of the standard for the core vCenter application, or the minimum requirements for that. If you're going to put all your roles on one server, VMware recommends at least 12 gigabytes of memory, and they recommend a lot more free space for the database. So, and then for the database requirements, if you're running the Windows version, they support SQL 2005, Service Pack 4 or newer, or Oracle 11G. Now there's some catches with that in terms of specific service packs that are supported with each version. So you're going to want to check the VMware compatibility matrix. I have a link for that at the bottom of the screen here. And it'll actually give you the rundown of what databases are supported with which versions. And it kind of changes and it kind of jumps around a little bit. For 5.5, if you are on Server 2008, Service Pack 2, or Server 2012, you are pretty much supported. If you have something older, you're definitely going to want to check the compatibility matrix. If you're setting up a small environment, the installer actually gives you the option to install SQL Server 2008 Express as part of that install, and it'll take care of configuring the database and the user account for you. It's a good option, but there's a 5-host, 50 VM limit, and there are some limits to SQL Express. Like you're limited to 1 gig of RAM for the database engine, and with Server 2008 R2, they upped the database size to 10 gigabytes. Make sure that if you're building a larger environment or you're doing something with VDI, that you put it on a regular database instead of SQL Express. I've had this happen once. A consultant in an environment I worked in built us a vCenter with SQL Express, and it was for a 200-seat VDI environment. Well, 6 months later, the database ran out of space, and it took the whole environment down for a couple of hours while we got that migrated over. So make sure you know the limits of the built-in database before you install. There are some challenges to moving the database because VMware does include some roll-up jobs that need to be moved over as well. And if those don't move over with it, your database will balloon, and it won't run the roll-ups on the statistics to kind of shrink some of that space down. I shouldn't say and finally. Next is service accounts. If you're running in a Windows environment, VMware strongly recommends that you use a service account for running the vCenter server application. That service account should be located in Active Directory. It's going to need some permissions on the database, and it's going to need some specific permissions in the operating system as well. The reason for doing it as a service account is you're segregating your permissions, and then you don't have to worry about giving the full server computer account access to the database or using SQL authentication, which is not as secure as integrated Windows authentication. As I said, that service account should be located in Active Directory to make it easier to manage passwords. Now, one thing with newer Active Directory environments too, and I haven't tried this, is that there is the option to use a managed service account. From the way the installer runs, I don't think that option would actually work, but it might be possible, and it's something that I'd have to look into if anybody was wondering about that. So if you plan to install single sign-on on a separate server, if your environment requires that component to be highly available or you're going to be installing it in multiple sites, the requirements for it are 2 cores, 3 gig of RAM, and 2 gigabytes of data. With the re-architecting that VMware did in vSphere 5.5, no database is required because it's built on LDAP. So it's a multi-master LDAP database. And finally, Ssl certificates. This is one of those things that can cause a lot of pain if it's not set up properly. There's 3 main certificates that are required. You need one for the vCenter server application, you need one for the web client, and you need one for single sign-on. If you don't have these, it can break stuff in your environment. Or I shouldn't say necessarily break something in your environment, but it can make it harder to configure. I know Horizon View will squawk at you if you don't have a trusted certificate for your vCenter. There's other components, I believe, that also prefer valid certificates. And if you want more information on doing something with certificates in vCenter, the person really to look for is Derek Seaman. He has written a wonderful series, I believe it's up to 19 parts, on vSphere 5.5, and he has about 4 or 5 posts on SSL certificates in a vSphere environment. He also has a toolkit built on PowerShell that will configure, that will basically automate the entire certificate process for you for the Windows Server version of vSphere. It's worth taking a look at because it makes it really easy to get your environment up and running with proper certificates. So, and then the last thing, I promise this is the last thing, permissions and role-based access control. vCenter has a very robust permissions model where you can create custom roles and grant permissions at a fairly granular level. And it can include permissions on a variety of areas, including vCenter management, cluster management, host management, VMs, and you can actually assign these at multiple levels too. So if you have multiple data centers in your vSphere or multiple clusters, if you have particular folders that you want to delegate administration to, you can create custom roles and assign them at pretty much any level, including at the VM level itself. One thing about permissions is that they tend to be a union of permissions. So if you have somebody who has permissions on a VM and permissions on a folder, and say the permissions on the folder are fairly restrictive to like read-only, but permissions on the VM are, you know, basically vSphere administrator level permissions, it's going to take the sum of permissions. It's not going to restrict you based on the folder level. This can kind of cause some confusion if you have roles with, you know, say specific features, like you have a help desk person who's only supposed to be able to turn on VMs and reboot them, and a person on that help desk is also an application owner of, say, the help desk system server, which gives them, you know, significantly more, like the ability to take snapshots. It's going to give you a union of those permissions. And the permissions can be based on a number of different identity sources. You can do local single sign-on. Within that LDAP database for single sign-on, you can do Active Directory-based permissions, and you can even do other LDAP. So if you have eDirectory or Open LDAP, you can tie that in with your environment. So if you're interested in learning more about vCenter, before we go into the live demos here, there's a couple of good sources. The Mastering vSphere 5.5 book has a really good chapter on setting up vCenter and the different features of it. Also, as I mentioned before, Derek Siemens' blog, the 19-part vSphere 5.5 walkthrough, and the PowerShell toolkit. And then Mike Laverick has a Back to Basics series, which includes installing the vCenter 5.5 Windows application. And I know I didn't talk about it too much here, but if you're interested in learning about the vCenter 5.5 appliance, I actually have a 6-part series on my blog that includes a 2-part series on configuring Ssl certificates for the appliance. The SSL for the appliance is kind of a non-trivial task. You have to have some command line comfort, so I kind of walk you through that whole process. So we're going to try to do a couple of demos here. We're going to cover installing vCenter on Windows, and that includes the data source and database setup, and then going through some of the authentication providers and role-based permissions. If time allows, we'll try to get to some of the vCenter server appliance configuration stuff, but I'm not sure we're going to have enough time for that. Also, as we go through the demo here, the laptop I'm using for the presentation with VMware Workstation only has about 8 gig of RAM, so we won't be covering anything like adding an ESXi host or configuring a VM through vCenter or doing any permissions at that level, just because my laptop falls over and dies if I try to do too much with it. So so just kind of a fair warning there. We're kind of stick strictly to what's here on the list. We're not going to try to branch out from that too much. So as I set the demo up, are there any questions? I kind of went through this here pretty quick.
So far, none. We did have one question, but I didn't know the person who asked it. It's clear my mind. Troy asked the question of he's had a security audit and they went through SSO, and via the method of using SSO single sign-on, they felt that that was a security risk. So how would you recommend ensuring and proving to them that it's not a security risk?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's actually a very tough one. I'm not sure I would say SSO is a security risk per se. In some ways, it seems like it's almost misnamed as single sign-on, but
yeah,
because it's more of like a central authentication source or provider for an entire vSphere stack. I don't know how I would answer the question of an auditor thinking it's a security risk.
Yeah, I mean, I did respond to Troy saying I've asked a security contact of mine. As he said, SSO is not what they're concerned with. I think it's the ability to be able to touch all linked hosts and administer them. So, yeah, I've asked the security contact of mine within VMware how they get around, obviously, deploying SSO within, more secure customers, because I know a number of secure customers who have it and are obviously in government, and they seem to clear all of their security audits. So there must be a way. I just don't know it personally offhand either.
I guess what I would say would be lock up that there's a default admin password. It's administrator@vsphere.local. I mean, treat that like you would treat the root password for any Linux or Unix box, and then use the role-based permission control to really lock down your environment and tie it in with an external provider like Active Directory, because then you could at least say, well, see, here's our security groups, here's how we apply it, and you can map it kind of to the different objects, and then have a strict policy on who can actually use or see that vSphere or that SSO administrator password. Those are the only things I could think of, but reaching out, somebody at VMware or within, you know, a government IT department would probably be able to give a better answer to that.
Yeah. Yeah, as I say, yeah, I'll try and find out. I mean, if we actually do find an answer for it, maybe I'll try and even stick it in the blog posting for the follow-up if I don't find out the answer before the end of this, just in case people are also interested. Because it is a fair question.
And it's actually a very good question, too. The other option, too, potentially would be find a better auditor, because if they're not familiar with the technology and aren't able to give recommendations for improvement, and it's required, you may need to look at a different option or a second option. Yeah.
I guess you do probably like a defense in depth kind of scenario. So obviously SSO is one method in, but as long as you show separation and control of the passwords and role-based access control, etc., then hopefully you should be able to prove the auditor that way, because I guess the security question of anything is, if you had a rogue admin, what would you do to stop them? And that's always a hard one for any person. You know, even the person you trust, they might get angry with the company or whoever and decide to break everything and remove proof from the logs. So. Yeah.
So having good policies in place to counteract that. And then another option you could look at, which unfortunately is not a cheap option, but it looks like it may fit the bill in a case like this, is a company called HighTrust. They have a security appliance that ties in with vCenter, and it can give you even more granular control over the environment. So if you are worried about an administrator exceeding their authority, you can tie in approval processes for certain actions, like say they want to reboot a VM, it would kick off an approval to a manager. If they want to delete something, it would kick off an approval process. So they won't just be able to go in and do that, but that is a very pricey option to build on top of a vCenter environment. And I believe that's licensed per CPU, and it's not cheap. So it's one other option to potentially look at.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So, all right, so I have my demo vCenter or vSphere host set up here, and apologize if you can't see the whole screen. It doesn't fit too well within my window here. Let's see if I can adjust this. There we go. All right, so what we're going to cover here is the installation process for vCenter Server on a Windows machine. Before we can install the vCenter components, though, there's a couple of steps we need to take first. We need to get our service account set up so that it has the correct roles both on the server itself and on the database. And then we need to run through the installation of SSO, the web client, and inventory service. Once we get done with that, we'll kind of go through configuring SSO a little bit and setting up permissions. So this is a almost brand new Windows server here. The database is installed. I am using the SQL Express edition for the demo, and that's the SQL Express 2008 R2 Service Pack 2. So the first thing we really need to do is we need to create our vCenter database. And we're going to do that by logging into our SQL Server Management Studio. All of this is set up with the default permissions. Obviously, in your production environments, your database team may take care of some of this, or you may have more lockdown permissions. So first thing, let's create the database. So I'm just going to call this one here, vCenter Demo. I'm just going to create a very simple blank database. After that, we need to create a login on the database for our service account. Now, I've already gone ahead and I've set up the service account in Active Directory before this. So we'll go ahead and add that in. Of course, it helps if you also make sure you select the entire directory option when doing the search. And then we're going to set that default database to the vCenter Demo. And then most of the documentation I found says you don't need to give it anything more than database owner rights. Unfortunately, every time I actually tested out this procedure before today's webinar, I had to give it sysadmin rights, otherwise it wouldn't be able to install some of the stored procedures that it needed. So this is just a temporary, just for setting up the database. After you get that done, you can go ahead and remove sysadmin rights. And then you need to map the user to the vCenter database, and you need to make sure it has DB owner rights. So now that we've got that set up, the next thing for us to do is to configure our data source. vCenter needs a 64-bit Odbc data source driver in order to run properly, and it needs to be one of the system data source drivers. So see here we have SQL client, SQL native client 2010, and we'll just call this vCenter Demo. And for the server here, I'll just put in localhost since it's based on the local machine. In your production environment, obviously this would be the server name or the server and instance name for the production database. We're going to leave this as integrated Windows authentication. When we set up vCenter, we're actually going to run it as the service account, and that's going to actually handle that's going to provide the credentials for the database. We want to change our default database to the vCenter Demo. And then basically the rest here, we just want to test to make sure we can connect to the database server, and that's it. The next step in the process is we need to grant our service account a couple of permissions on the system. The first one we need to grant is local administrator rights. The service account that's going to run the vCenter service needs to be an administrator on the system. So we'll go ahead and add that in. And then we need to add in two other security permissions in the local security policy. And those permissions are act as part of the operating system and log on as a service. Okay, so once we have all those installed, we can actually start our install. I have the ISO mounted up already. What we're going to do is I'm actually going to run the install as the service account. When you install vCenter, if you install it as, say, like your administrator, your local systems administrator, or a different domain account that's not the service account, it's not going to allow you to change that when it gets to the part where it requests a password. You have to run the installation as that service account. So let's go ahead here. Right. So there's two ways you can install vCenter when you're actually doing the installation. There's a simple install, which will go through, it'll install all 4 components, and it'll take care of configuring that for you. Or there's the custom install, and this is where you can install each component individually. When you do the custom install, it's going to ask you for, the location of the single sign-on service. It's going to ask you to provide the administrator password for the default SSO user at each step. The simple install takes care of all of that for you. It just kind of passes those attributes between each installer. For the purpose of this demo, I'm going to cover the custom install. And you'll see here there's a recommended order that they want you to install everything in. The first thing that has to be installed is the single sign-on service, because every other component here is going to talk to that. That's how you're going to authenticate with them. The next thing that is recommended is the web client. The main reason for installing the web client second is because that's the only client that can actually administer SSO. So if you install SSO and you have a problem and you don't install the web client next, you won't be able to administer it until you get to that step. So I've heard some stories of people who haven't quite done it in this order and things have blown up on them and they weren't able to manage it or to complete the installation, so they had to start over because something went wrong with the single sign-on install. So we'll start with that first. Now, a lot of what we're going to see here is basically click, click, next. There's not a lot that we have to change with the installation. So obviously we need to accept the license agreement. We'll have to do this at every step. Now, the first thing single sign-on will check is to see if you're joined to a domain and if DNS is working properly. It's also going to give you the option to add the domain that you're logged in as an Active Directory identity source. So when you work with the appliance, you have to go in and configure that separately as a step later on. But with the Windows application, it's going to detect Active Directory right away and configure that as part of the install for you. It also gives you options on what type of single sign-on environment you want. We're going to select the first option here, which is single sign-on for your first server, but it also gives you the option to add additional SSO servers within your site or at an alternate site. So if you have multiple data centers and you want to have fully redundant SSO, you can set up SSO at each individual site, and you would actually select the bottom option for that. Or if you wanted to have more than one SSO server in your current site, then you could set that up as an option as well. They give a lot of options here for redundancy because this is a critical service. If this, like I said before, if this goes down, you actually won't be able to log into your vSphere environment. So it's going to prompt us for a password. This password or account is the only account that can log in once we complete the setup. So it gives you, so that account is administrator at vsphere.local. This is the first account that can log in. It's kind of like the domain administrator account when you're setting up a new Windows Active Directory domain. Similar concept to that. This account has power, basically domain admin rights for your vSphere environment. One other thing too is you can configure different sites within your single sign-on environment, like I mentioned before. So you can give your site a name. The site it's going to name it is the default first site. But you can change that, so if you have like a data center in London and a data center in Liverpool, you can name them London and Liverpool, or Paris and Marseille, or Rome and Milan, or any number of different locations. You're also going to have a HTTPS port. The default for that is 7444. If there's no need to change that, I recommend leaving that as the default. And then finally, it asks you where you want to install it. You can change that to any other directory. So one last step to review the settings, and then we'll go ahead and click install, and it's going to install the components here that it needs. So while we wait for this to finish, are there any other questions, comments? Want to banter about your favorite World Cup team?
Favorite World Cup team? I don't know if we should get into that.
Okay.
So Rasmus was saying, might be worth mentioning this. Account administrator vsphere.local initial password is also used for SSO master password.
Yes, that's correct. That is the SSO master password. So that's a password and an account you really want to protect. Unlike Active Directory, I don't think you can go in and really rename that password or strip it of its rights. So that account, make sure it's a very complex password. Protect it very well, because if somebody gets a hold of it, they can go in and pretty much do anything with your environment.
Yeah, don't have any other. Rasmus says you can let the account's password expire, and then you can use an AD account to admin the SSO.
Yeah, and that's actually one thing. If we have the time here to cover that, I'll actually show how to add an AD user or group to the SSO and administrator group. One thing about that, though, and that is a method for managing SSO, but if you let that account expire and then something happens to your Active Directory, say you're in a DR situation,
yeah.
You would need to have that password to get in to at least get your domain controllers up and running.
Sure.
So there's trade-offs to doing that. Like if you have to do a complete cold recovery of your environment, SSO is going to be one of the first things you'd probably want to have access to that password for, so you can get in, get vSphere up, and then use vSphere to get everything else up and running. That's one potential way to do it. The other is you could have a host in like a management cluster that you could log into with the root credentials and have your AD and your vCenter and SSO all on that box to bring up at the same time. But if you decide to let that SSO password expire, just be aware that it could impact your DR plan if you don't have Active Directory available.
Yeah.
So. Right, unfortunately, this part's kind of like watching paint dry. So I don't have a way to really make this go faster while it installs. All right, well, there we go. So now this has completed the single sign-on setup. The next thing we want to install right away is the web client. Without the web client, we won't be able to administer single sign-on. No, unfortunately it's not done installing, it's just hiding. So again, we need to accept the license agreement, tell it what folder we want to install in. Then it's going to ask us for our ports. We could just leave those as the default. And then it's going to ask us for our vSphere .local administrator password so we can register the web client with that service. Since we're doing everything on one VM, the lookup service URL is going to be the host name. If you did put single sign-on on, say, a separate server, you'd want to have the host name or URL for that to put in this box here. Because we're using default certificates here, we have to accept the thumbprint because it's an untrusted self-signed cert. And again, this is the part again where we're back to waiting a little bit. And then, okay, we have to install a self-signed certificate for the web client. The web client generates its own. That'll be used when you log into it. So we'll go ahead and install that certificate, and then we install the application. All right, any second here and this should be finished up, and then we'll move on to the inventory service. I know we're running kind of short on time here. Okay, so the next step here is going to be installing the inventory service. While that installs, we can wait for the web client to finish loading up here. And where did I put that window? Okay, here it is. All right, so we'll get this inventory service quickly set up. Again, pretty much click next all the way through. We just need to include our server fully qualified domain name. Quick look at the HTTP ports it uses. And then we need to set the size of our JVM memory heap. Most environments should be able to select small, which is less than 100 hosts or 1,000 virtual machines. That's going to require about 3 gig of RAM. So we'll go ahead and select that for this one. Now, from a sizing perspective, I don't know if that can be changed. I've never been in a situation where I've needed to. Every environment I've worked in, it's just been click small, and that's way more, that's way more hosts or VMs that I would actually have. So if your environment does grow to the point where you kind of start to cross that threshold between small and medium, I'm not sure if there's a way to change that. All right, so we just have to register inventory service with the single sign-on service. Accept the certificate. I know we're kind of coming up on time here. I mean, is it a problem if we go over probably about 15 minutes or so?
That should be cool.
Okay. This seems to have run faster when I was doing my my practice runs. All right, so we'll go ahead and install that. And then the last component we need to install here is vCenter Server. Now when we do this installation, once it finishes with the actual vCenter Server application, it will also install vCenter Orchestrator and the profile-driven storage components. So we'll go ahead and start this up. And again, just kind of click next through. If we had a license key for this, we could put it in here. Otherwise, you can also put that in through the web client. Now this is where you get to kind of pick your database options. This is why we created the data source ahead of time. It gives us either the option to install SQL Server Express and it'll configure it for us, or we can use an existing database connection, which is our vCenter demo that we did earlier. So for this, we'll set it up using the demo data source. If we had SQL Server authentication turned on, we'd be able to put the username and password in, but that option's turned off for now. It does test to make sure it can reach the database. If it can't, it'll actually kick up a screen with a JBDC URL that you'll need to use for testing. So if your database is on a non-default port, if it's not assigned to port 1433, that test will fail. And if you're using multiple instances, the non-default instances of SQL Server will get random port assignments, so you'll need to fix that SQL instance to a specific port and make sure it's open in the Windows firewall. Now for here, since we're running the installer as the service account we're going to use, it's going to ask us for the password. It'll go ahead, and when we're finished, and when we look in the Windows services, we'll see that it's running as this particular user. So we'll go ahead and just put the password in. It gives us the option to create a standalone or to join to an existing linked mode group. We don't have any linked mode stuff, so we're just going to go ahead with that. And then finally, here's a list of all the ports that vCenter is going to use on the system. There's also an option here for the number of ephemeral ports that you can have to increase that by default. Chances are you're not going to use this because it deals with powering on 2,000 or more virtual machines at the same time on a single host. I don't know of too many instances where that would apply. Obviously, there are some really large environments out there where this would be an issue, but most of the time, you probably don't need to check this. And then we also have to configure the size of our Java memory here. Again, small, uses only about 1 gigabyte, so we'll go with that. And then we have to register it with single sign-on. And accept the certificate. And then we wait. So while we're waiting for this and walking through the final parts, any questions? Comments?
Present.
Okay. So, and finally, it's asking us for the vCenter, the administrator account that's going to be recognized by single sign-on. We'll just leave the default in there. It does give you the option to put a user group in there, so if you do have an Active Directory group and this isn't your first installation, or the first one is part of a single sign-on, you can change that. It's going to ask for the inventory service URL, so you'll want to know that if you put that on a different host. And then we'll go ahead, click Next. Pick the folder where we're going to install it to, and then just click Install. And then we wait. So this should only take a couple of minutes here. And you'll see as we go through here, it'll install the vCenter component, it'll install Orchestrator, and then launch a separate little installer for the profile-driven storage. Now, simple install kind of takes care of all of this as basically one big step. It installs everything to one single machine. And you don't have to worry about all those little steps where you have to register with SSO, put the password in, make sure the link is correct. It takes care of all of that for you. Well, while we're waiting for this part to finish up here, because at this point it's just going to finish the install, let's go ahead and log into our Vsphere Web Client. So because we don't have a trusted certificate, we get these wonderful security warnings. So at this point when we log in, we actually won't be able to see vCenter because it's not finished with its installation. But we will be able to set up our we'll be able to set up our Active Directory authentication source, add in our user groups, and even configure some of the roles that we're going to do or use. So when you log into the web client, SSO is administrated or is managed under this administration tab, and we have the option under users and groups to add in our administrators. Now this is kind of the default administrators group inside SSO. So from here we can actually add in our Active Directory group. So like say we have a group called vSphere or vCenter. So we have our vCenter admins. We can add them right into this SSO administrators group, and whenever anybody who's part of that Active Directory group logs in, they'll be able to administer SSO. So, and we could see here too, the SSO provider actually will let us see users within our Active Directory and whether they're locked out or disabled. So if somebody does call in and say, hey, I can't get in, an administrator with rights on SSO can actually go and say, oh, you're locked out, or your account was turned off, or something to that effect. So let's go check, make sure, see how we're doing here. Almost done. If we had a license key we wanted to add in, but we didn't add it in during the install, we could, there's a licensing section here where we could add it in, and then roles is where we'll go to configure our permissions and our different roles within the environment once the installation finishes. All right, so we're installing Orchestrator, then we just have the profile-driven storage piece left, and then the install will be complete. So while we're waiting for that, I will sign out because we will need to sign back in once the vCenter server installation completes. All right, so vCenter server is now installed on this server. If we go and take a look at our services, we'll see that it is actually running as the service account we installed it as, which is right here. So we'll see that vCenter server and the management web services are both running as the service account. Now if we sign back in, we'll be able to create different permissions for our environment. So the way we go about creating permissions is under Administration, Roles. We'll see here that our provider is whatever vCenter servers we have in the environment. And there's a couple of roles right out of the box, read-only, administrator, then there's some sample power user type roles that are specific to certain tasks within the environment. The recommendation I've heard is that to use these as kind of a template and copy them before making changes, as opposed to just making a change to the default permissions in here. These make good baselines for roles, but they may not necessarily be what you want to use in production. So the method for creating a role, go ahead and create one here. So say we have our help desk has admin or has some privileges within vCenter. We'll call this role help desk, and basically we allow them to power on VMs, but that's it, or power on and reset VMs. So we can go in and do that, and under, for instance, interaction, we can configure, the ability to manage the operating system with VIX, so we can tell it to reboot, we can tell it to power on, and we can tell it to do a hard reset. So when we assign that privilege to whatever location in our environment, anybody in that help desk role, if they log in, that's all they would have. So our method for doing that is we go into our vCenter. Now, our inventory, there's not going to be anything in it here because we don't have any data centers set up, we don't have any clusters or ESXi hosts to add in. But we can do this from the root of vCenter. So if we assign a permission here, it's going to apply to all objects underneath it unless we manually change that. So for instance, I can add in a new role. I want to assign, I want to add in a new permission, and I want to assign the administrator role to my vCenter admins group. So I can apply that here at the top level, make sure it's set to propagate to children, and then whenever I add a folder, add a VM, add a cluster, this permission will apply. It'll inherit this permission from its parent. But say I want to apply this help desk role to my help desk group. Same concept. I select the role, which will be my help desk role, and then I search for my help desk group, which is my vCenter help desk role. And if I apply it here, this will also apply to children, to the child objects, but whenever they log in, what they see in the inventory is going to be significantly different. So if I were to log out right now, and log in as my help desk user, hold on one second here. Oh, wait. And if I were to go into vCenter and look at my hosts and clusters, I won't see anything. There'll be no inventory there because I don't have permission to do anything besides turn on VMs and reboot them. So I won't see, the root level vCenter object because I don't have permissions to look at stats or anything like that. Now there's one more quick thing I'm going to show you as an administrator. If you're in a single domain environment and you don't want to be typing in your user or your UPN as your username, you can actually set a default domain at so when a user logs in, it'll apply that last portion of the username to the login. And to do that, we go into Administration and Single Sign-On Configuration. And here's a list of all your identity sources. I can select my domain, and then there's this little blue button here. When I mouse over it, it says Set as Default. If I set this as the default, I'll be able to log in as a user without having to do that full name. I can also add a new identity source. So if I have an open LDAP server that I want to add in, I can configure it here. If I'm doing the vCenter appliance and I want to do Active Directory, I have to configure that as an Active Directory as an LDAP server, which is an option here, and just fill in all these different details. So let me just demonstrate this quickly. We'll log out as our administrator, and we will log in as our help desk user again. Of course, it help if I put the right password in. So as you see there, I was able to log in as my domain help desk user without having to have the full domain name appended to the end. So that pretty much wraps up everything I was going to cover. Greg, are there any more questions, comments?
So there was, Troy asked, is there any way to disable or gray out the use Windows session authentication when running from the web client?
Yes, there is actually. The ability to use the Windows session authentication requires the client integration tool to be installed. If you don't install that, you won't have the option to use Windows session authentication. The flip side of that is you also won't be able to do some file operations because that component is used for uploading OVF files or uploading ISO files to your data stores. So if you don't install that tool, you won't get that option to use Windows session authentication, but you also kind of lose a little bit of functionality on the file operation side. Now there may be another method of doing that. However, I haven't run across anything that would say, okay, turn off integrated Windows authentication from the web client. But that option may be out there. I mean, there's a lot of custom attributes you can configure within vCenter, so that may be one of them.
Cool. Any more questions? Cool. Yeah, that's good. Thanks for that, Sean. That was really good, and thanks for doing the demo. Demos are always really popular and really interesting for people, so that was super helpful. Yeah, thanks for presenting. Thanks everybody for joining. I'll try to get the recording up as soon as possible. I just need to encode it and then get it onto YouTube, which I need to find some time in my relatively busy day. Troy said, thanks so much for the presentation. And yeah, thanks Sean. I think it's still in the afternoon for you, so hope you have a good rest of your day, and thanks for presenting again.
All right, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, and everybody have a wonderful evening.
All right, awesome. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.